Hello. And let's see, Najla, are you here? Oh, she didn't make it, okay. Well, I do still want to say thank you, Najla, for your honesty, for your vulnerability, for telling your story in your way, and for reminding us that surviving domestic violence isn't neat or perfect. It's a process. And so, yes, something is lost. A million somethings are lost, even in the survival. And learning to live on the forever shifted ground is lifelong work. And we're with you. So much of that lifelong work comes with excavation, mining memories, just trying to understand or make some kind of sense of it all. And stories, language, those are the miner's tools. And they are certainly Natasha's tools. Natasha uses language as both a magnifier and a mirror, showing and telling of the scars of loss, of living with racism, othering, and holding grief. Natasha Trethewey is currently the Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. Her work includes the prize-winning collections Domestic Work in 2000, Native Guard in 2007, and Thrall in 2012. She was named the 2008 Georgia Woman of the Year, and Natasha has been inducted into both the Fellowship of Southern Writers and the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. She served as the 19th U.S. Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2014. Natasha has earned a long list of honors, awards, and praise, all deserved. But I'm guessing that among the biggest honors is being called Gwendolyn Ann Turnbough's daughter. Too often, when your life is lost to domestic violence, that becomes your whole story. But Gwen was not a victim. She was a mother and so much more. In her 2020 memoir, Memorial Drive, Natasha reclaims her mother's life from the one-dimensional headlines. Natasha shares that her mother was graceful and reserved, and she was beautiful too. She had a really lovely lime green jumpsuit, and she was deeply loved by her own mother, Natasha's grandmother. Natasha's mother, Gwen, loved to read and to dance. She was determined and she was smart, having figured out how to navigate the hostile world she was born into as a Black person in 1944, and later earning a master's degree in social work. Gwen could be private with her thoughts and feelings, and I gathered from a sentence in the book that, like me, she didn't have a good sense of direction. She was ambitious. She loved music and touring grand houses. Her closet of clothes sewn by her own hands using Vogue and Butterick patterns carried the sense of wool and lavender. Gwen was loved. Gwen is missed. And I'm happy to introduce her daughter, Natasha. Thank you for introducing Gwen, your mother, the person, to us. We hope that our work honors her as she deserves. So I'm proud to introduce Natasha Trethewey. So can everyone hear me okay? All right. So I have some notes on my phone of questions that I'd like to share, if that's okay. As soon as I get to it, so my page seems to have gone away from me. How are you doing? Welcome.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction.
Oh, I'm glad to do it. And I'm so glad that you're here. And, just like we talked about, surviving is a process. It's not perfect. And so we're just going to go as fast or as slow as we need to. And I will ask questions, and if it's okay to answer, yes. If it's not okay, that's okay too. Okay. So my first question comes from page 49 of the book. There's a passage where you say, "It took me a long time to realize how fully I had accepted my parents' narrative of the situation. For most of my life, I have told myself that this separation didn't trouble me." And so I'm wondering, many of us live with a personal narrative that has been given to us. What are some ways we can begin to mine our own experiences for the real story? And what can you share about your own experience of exploring and being with the real story?
Thank you for that question, Barbara. One of the things that I have to say about that, the story that my parents gave me when they divorced when I was a small child included things like, you have the best of both worlds. You will be able to go to 2 different homes where 2 sets of people love you. And that was true. So the story that they were giving me was not an untrue story. And I could take that story and incorporate it into my own story about myself and how I felt about my parents no longer being together. And that was important, to be able to take the pieces of one's memory or the stories that you've been given to make your own story about it. But as you say, there are other kinds of stories that we are given about ourselves that are not useful. I was born in Mississippi in 1966 on Confederate Memorial Day when it was still illegal for my parents to be married. I was rendered in the eyes of the law illegitimate, persona non grata. So the state of Mississippi and at least 20 other states in the nation didn't think that I deserved to be a legitimate citizen and that my parents deserved to be legitimately married. They were telling me a story about who I was in the United States and what I could expect about my place in the United States as a black person, as a mixed-race black person. Confederate monuments do that all the time. They tell us who we are supposed to be and what our place is in the world. Those are the kinds of narratives and received knowledge that we have to push back against. So at once, I am both pushing back against that, but I am also incorporating the pieces of the story, the loving story my parents gave me, in order to shape a narrative of myself. One in which I am in control, one in which I write the story. I like to think about it. If you look up and you look at these lights, it reminds me of a metaphor I use all the time about the constellations of stars. There was that moment when the ancients looked up in the stars and at the stars in the sky, and they saw thousands of stars. And yet they chose to draw very specific constellations, which began to tell a particular story that they could address and explain their own situation when they looked up in the sky. But they could have told countless others by countlessly drawing those lines. I have drawn the lines of the story that I need to tell and not allowing someone else to draw it for me.
Thank you. So many people need to hear that. We have to be able to tell our own stories. So thank you. So
one of the quickest ways you might notice for me to rewrite a little bit of the narrative here when I'm weeping because I feel like my mother's name is being invoked and who she was, and I want to stop crying, let me just talk about the Confederacy. And you see it's not happening anymore. Now, it may come back, but right now I'm okay.
Yeah. I so appreciate you saying that because that's exactly right. It's not as if you survive domestic violence and then there's never, ever going to be sadness, you know. Yeah, it will be there, and that's okay. And there's also strength. There's also joy. Yeah, so, yeah. So there's a part in the book where you say, last night I heard my stepfather hit my mother. And the teacher, Mrs. Messick, says, sometimes adults get angry with each other. And I wanted to bring out this point in particular because so many of us have that very same exchange with people who are also experiencing domestic violence, and we gloss over it, we make excuses, and we don't realize the impact that it has on that person, that these interactions shape people's experiences, their values. They may determine whether they will ask for help again or not. Mm-hmm. And so we're always learning from each other, and we're creating and reinforcing cultural norms and values, as well as our sense of self in these daily interactions. So I'm guessing that your feelings included frustration and powerlessness, but was there something more or something else when you were listening to her response? And how do you think about that experience now? Was there something that you wish she could have said or done differently?
Yeah, you know, I think in that moment, and I write this, that I knew that there was nothing that she was going to do. And it was a moment of feeling very isolated in the situation that I was experiencing at home, the situation that my mother was in. Because I indeed had gone to the person outside of the home that I felt the closest to. I mean, now, I'm a university professor, and we have training every year and all sorts of protocols about how we are supposed to deal with someone who comes and tells us about something like that. But back then, that didn't exist. She was kind, but she also did brush it off. And so I felt at that moment that I had nowhere else to turn, that if anything was going to happen, I had to do it myself. What I think that
as a child.
I was a child. I was. And so, you know, I went home that night, and I waited until my mother was alone. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I was standing right in front of her. And so because she was sitting and I was standing, I was a little taller than her at that moment. And I said to her, Mommy, do you know how when someone you love is hurting, it hurts you too? And I tried to get through saying the whole thing before I looked directly into her eyes. And she knew at that moment that I knew. And later on that night, I heard her telling him, Tasha knows. And I know that she was telling him because she thought that maybe if he knew that I knew, that might make it stop. Well, it didn't. But it was a moment of feeling like I had nowhere to turn and I had to do something about it, which is why organizations like this are so important, so that the women know they have somewhere to go. But I think if there's a way that also children know that there's someone who will listen and do something.
You deserved that. Yeah. And I'm glad that we're here now to make that happen. Thank you. So there's a part on page 17 where you use the language coming of age to describe your mom's growing up, and you use the language growing up to describe your dad's growing up. And I'm wondering if these different ways of describing their growing up, if you're wanting to convey something to us about the differences in their path from childhood to adulthood. I mean, obviously there were vast differences.
I think that's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that, and I hadn't actually thought consciously about what the difference means. But in that passage that you're describing, I actually say, my mother came of age a black girl in the Deep South, in the Jim Crow South, in a world circumscribed by Jim Crow. She was coming of age and coming into an age of Jim Crow, an age in which, again, the expectations of her citizenship and her humanity in a place like Mississippi was deeply limited in the ways that my white father, growing up a white boy in rural Nova Scotia, free to roam the open woods, free to be a man, and a white man, was very different. So yes, their growing up and coming of age were very different.
Yeah, thank you. This is one of my favorite pieces. On page 113, your mom says, "She will do whatever she wants."
She will do whatever she wants.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And you say, "Even now I hear my mother's voice, her measured restraint, the origins of my own." I love this validation. It's so powerful. And I want to know, there's probably a million things you could say about this, but how do you experience this memory now, and how does this affirmation live in you now?
Well, that was such a pivotal moment. It's a chapter in which I'm describing coming home from school, from high school, being very excited about what I'm reading in my English class, what I'm writing, that I've written a short story, I've joined the literary society. I'm very excited about all of these things, and usually, in order to avoid the wrath of his jealous anger, I would keep these things to myself until I could see my mother alone to tell her. But I'm so excited this night that I can't, and so I blurted out at the table, and he says to me, "You're not going to do any of that." And that's the moment that my mother says she will do whatever she wants. Because as much as she was trying to contend with his attempts to destroy herself, she was not going to allow him to destroy me. And the cost was what he was going to do to her later on that night. And I knew what was going to happen to her. And I think that her act of courage, her defiance, in order to save me, is part of what she gave me, part of the resilience she gave me. But also, I am a poet. And because I am a poet, I am so interested in the power of words. The words we say, as well as the ones that we hold back. The way we use silence and white space that sometimes speaks louder than anything else. And poetry, language, as necessary utterance. That was the most necessary thing my mother could say right then. She could be restrained until she absolutely had to say in order to change the course of the world for me.
I'm glad for that path. So you also say, I would have had to become a writer. I would have to become a writer. That because of the nature of my experience, I would have something necessary to say. And still there is more, because the loss is not singular and cannot be fully articulated. And so what are some of the things that made your mom uniquely herself? And so I know that she loved music, I think. And she loved to dance when she felt free. And I'm wondering if there are smells or sounds or foods that return her to you, or maybe one of your favorite stories about Gwen.
Oh. I think that's the hardest question in some ways because, you know, one writes a book in order to try to convey something about who she was. I could have spent, when I first set out to write Memorial Drive, I could have spent the rest of my life working on it because what I wanted to do initially was to research my mother as I might research any historical figure and to write a biography because I really wanted the world to know who she was. But it became increasingly clear to me that whereas I could spend forever doing that, the best way to show who she was to write a memoir about who I became in the light of her life and her death. It's why I use the epigraph from Shakespeare's Sonnet Number 3. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. If you want to know anything about the woman my mother was, just look at me.
We see you. So, the last thing I'll say, in addition to we do see you, and we hope that we honor you and your mother each day with our work, and just remembering that, you know, working with survivors, the loss is not singular. So there are so many different things that you do miss about a person that it could be millions of things, like their smile or a secret joke that you shared. And so we do recognize that. And we do want you to know how glad we are to walk with survivors in your mom's name.
Thank you.
Yeah. What has it meant to know that the Women's Resource Center is here?
Well, it goes back to that feeling of isolation, of thinking that there's no one out there who understands what it is you're going through. And yet there is a place, and there are some people, and they do know. And there is a place for you to go. If you need people who will understand and not judge and to help you find a path forward.
We are definitely trying. Thank you so much, Natasha.
Thank you.
So, can we prevail upon you to read a bit from your book?
Yes, this will make me stop crying because art does that. This is a poem that is the first poem in my retrospective monument, Poems New and Selected. When I wrote this book, I was writing it at the same time I was writing the memoir, and I wanted to show the arc of my career and why it is I became a writer in the first place, the thing that ultimately hurt me into poetry. And it's a poem that is a response to all of the kinds of things, I'm sure so many of you have heard them, that people say to or about victims of domestic violence. Imperatives for carrying on in the aftermath. Do not hang your head or clench your fists when even your friend, after hearing the story, says, "My mother would never put up with that." Fight the urge to rattle off statistics that, more often, a woman who chooses to leave is then murdered. The 100th time your father says, "But she hated violence. Why would she marry a guy like that?" Don't waste your breath explaining again how abusers wait, are patient, that they don't beat you on the first date, sometimes not even the first few years of a marriage. Keep an impassive face whenever you hear "stand by your man," and let go your rage when you recall those words were advice given your mother. Try to forget the first trial before she was dead, when the charge was only attempted murder. Don't belabor the thinking or the sentence that allowed her ex-husband's release a year later, or the juror who said, "It's a domestic issue. They should work it out themselves." Just breathe when, after you read your poems about grief, a woman asks, "Do you think your mother was weak for men?" Learn to ignore subtext. Imagine a thought cloud above your head, dark and heavy, with the words you cannot say. Let silence rain down. Remember you were told by your famous professor that you should write about something else. Unburden yourself of the death of your mother and just pour your heart out in the poems. Ask yourself what's in your heart, that reliquary, blood locket and seed bed, and contend with what it means. The folk saying you learned from a Korean poet in Seoul, that one does not bury the mother's body in the ground, but in the chest. Or, like you carry her corpse on your back.
Thank you.
Thank you. You could tell I was angry when I wrote that.
And sometimes there's power in anger, right? So it's been my great pleasure to talk with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all.
Natasha, it is such an honor and privilege to have you here tonight. Yes, it is. For those of us who've had the privilege of reading Memorial Drive, I mean, to hear you tell your story in person is just so impactful. So thank you for sharing with us. We at the Women's Resource Center are honored to continue this work, serving victims of domestic violence in the memory of your mother. So it's a real privilege. And I hope that you know that we are going to carry on this work as part of her legacy. So thank you. It is my distinct honor and privilege tonight to present you with the Women's Resource Center Clarence Seeliger Champion for Change Award for for 2022.
Well, you don't need to hear too much more from me, but I do just want to say what a great honor this is for me. To stand in a place that recognizes my mother's legacy. My friend Jean Douglas told me the story when I first met her, that the center was started after this woman was murdered in 1985. And for a long time, they didn't know who it was. And then they finally figured out that it was my mother. And of course, plenty of other women have lost their lives. And what I hope is that my mother's story can serve as a kind of clarion call and a beacon for the ongoing change that we have to make. It's hard not to weep at a moment like this, when I know that at least for a few minutes, all of you have thought about Gwendolyn Ann Turnbough. And that means the world to me. Thank you.